Okay, welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Professor John Tagg from Palomar College. John has written extensively on the topic of teaching and learning, including his essay with Robert Barr titled "From Teaching to Learning: A New Paradigm for Undergraduate Education," and a book titled "The Learning Paradigm College," and a recent book titled "The Instruction Myth: Why Higher Education is Hard to Change and How to Change It." I'm very grateful for him to accept to give a talk in this seminar. So without further delay, please take it away.
Thank you. Let me begin with a reflection on a somewhat recent event. At least I read about it recently. In this last Sunday's New York Times, there was the obituary of Sheila Tobias, which some of you may have heard of, maybe not. Sheila Tobias died actually over a year ago in a care center in Tucson after a fall. She was 86 years old. But she's notable to us because she is the woman who invented the term math anxiety. She was a feminist and a feminist scholar and writer. And in 1976, she had an article in Ms. Magazine titled Math Anxiety. And she was talking about the tendency of women to self-handicap in the face of cultural expectations that they just couldn't be any good at math. Cultural expectations, which I think have largely diminished in our time, but maybe not entirely. She wrote a book about it. She did workshops. She was an academic for a number of years, did a lot of interesting things. They didn't publish her obituary when she died because they didn't know. Nobody heard about it until somebody tried to call her and ask her a question, and she wasn't there anymore. But she's a woman worth remembering. And her research on math anxiety was part of a body of research about kinds of stereotype threat, kinds of beliefs about students by students that made students worse students. And the psychologist Albert Bandura at Stanford developed a whole theory around what he called self-efficacy. That is the extent to which you believe you can do stuff. One of his students was Carol Dweck, who I'm sure probably all of you have heard of. She developed the theory of self theories or mindsets. The idea that if you have a growth mindset, that is, if you believe that your capacities are malleable and changeable, that you can learn to do new things, that you can accomplish new stuff, then you're more likely to learn new things and accomplish more stuff. And if you don't believe that, if you have a fixed mindset, you'll just sit there and wait for the world to go by you. And in fact, math anxiety is a phenomenon of a fixed mindset about one's mathematical ability. I understand that because I am myself a sufferer from math anxiety. I feel a little intimidated talking to all these brilliant people, whereas I have a little bit challenged with the checkbook. And thank God we don't have to use them very much anymore. And I know why I had problems learning math. I can name the two teachers who did that to me. We'll get back to that maybe a little. Let me provide, I was asked to talk about the learning paradigm, and I'm going to do that. My apologies if a lot of this is redundant to some of you. But let me begin by talking a little bit about STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And again, if you already know this, perhaps it's okay to be reminded. In 2014, Scott Freeman, a biologist at the University of Washington, did a study with 6 colleagues where they synthesized 225 studies comparing the effectiveness of teaching in STEM courses using traditional lecture methods and active learning techniques. They found that, and I quote here from the study, active learning increases examination performance by just under half a standard deviation, and that lecturing increases failure rates by 55%. I mean, that's a stock dollar, as we used to say. Furthermore, these improvements, and I quote, hold across all the STEM disciplines and occur in all class sizes, course types, and course levels. And active learning confers disproportionate benefits for STEM students from disadvantaged backgrounds and for female students in male-dominated fields. So powerful was the more effective pedagogy that was tested that they concluded that if the experiments analyzed here had been conducted as randomized controlled styles of medical interventions, they may have been stopped for benefit, meaning that enrolling patients in the control condition, that is the normal condition of higher education, might be discontinued because the treatment being tested was clearly more beneficial. So, you know, that's a pretty good study. And there's been a follow-up study by some of Friedman's colleagues on specifically the effect on disadvantaged students and students who are underprepared that's found the same thing in spades. In 2018, about 4 years after this study was conducted, a woman named Marilyn Staines, who's an associate professor of chemistry at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, recruited about 24 colleagues because she was interested in finding, having read the Freeman study, she was interested in finding out, well, gee, are we doing this? And here's the thing. If you want to know how teachers are teaching, one thing you can't do for the most part at most institutions in this country is ask the institution, because they don't have the slightest idea. The teachers know, of course, you know, but I mean, I've asked a number of provosts, deans, and presidents this question: how do your teachers teach? And the answer is almost invariably, well, I was in Jack's class or Sally's class the other day, and they did this and that and the other thing. Or I don't know. So what did Marilyn Staines do? She recruited a couple of dozen of colleagues, and they went out to 24 research universities in one college. They went into 709 courses and actually taught by 549 different instructors, and actually sat there through the whole class and counted what, what teachers were doing in their teaching. Were they taking an active learning approach? Were they lecturing all the time? What are they doing? They found that lecture was the most common pedagogy. 55% of the courses used a didactic style, which meant that more than 80% of the class time consisted of lecturing. 27% employed interactive lecture, 18% were student-centered by the definition of this study. The researchers concluded didactic practices are prevalent throughout the undergraduate STEM curriculum, despite ample evidence for the limited impact of these practices and substantial interest on the part of institutions and national organizations in education reform. There's another study that I would call your attention to, and that's the pair of studies talking about leaving studies. Talking about leaving was a study that Elaine Seymour and Nancy Hewitt did in 1997. They interviewed 300 and some students at colleges and universities, 7 different institutions. And half the students had started out as STEM majors and kept their existing major. Half the students had started out as STEM majors and then switched to a different major or dropped out altogether. And they did extensive interviews with them to find out why they did that. That was a really interesting book, and heartbreaking, but interesting. I recommend it to you. But in 2019, Seymour and about 5 other colleagues got together and did the same study again, 20 some years later, and also combined research from a variety of other things. What they found, this is a quotation from Raquel Harper, Timothy Weston, and Elaine Seymour, reflecting on the original study and its follow-up. 78% of all students express frustrations with poor quality teaching, curriculum design, and assessment practices. 3/4 of persisters, that is people who stayed with their STEM majors, and 96% of switchers described how aspects of poor STEM teaching had negatively affected them. Sadly, 2 decades later, poor quality in STEM teaching and its negative consequences persists as the leading contributor both to the loss of STEM majors and negative experience for the majority of STEM students in this study. I'm not trying to just make you feel bad, and I have a strong suspicion that the people I'm talking to right now don't fall into the bad end of this distribution. If you weren't interested in the quality of your teaching and invested in it, you wouldn't be here. So I'm not talking about you, but I am talking about your institutions and their lack of, control. How does this happen? Is the base question. And I've situated it in the STEM fields because that's what all of you are teaching. But it happens because, let's just talk just a little bit about organizational theories. Chris Argyris is a professor of business and organizational theory at Harvard. In the 70s, a lot of good research happened in the 70s. In the 70s, he had a class that he was teaching at the Harvard Business School in how to be a business consultant. So he got a bunch of students together. He wrote a scenario in which a consultant encounters a business person, Mr. X, and has an exchange. He had all the students read the scenario, and then he had them write a critique of Mr. X, the consultant. The students almost uniformly panned Mr. X. They said he did a terrible job. He didn't follow the rules we've studied. He didn't implement good practice. Here. So a week or so later, he had a group of graduate students come into the same class, and they sat down with individual students in the class and did a role-playing exercise where the graduate student would be the business person and the student would be the consultant. And they tape recorded these interactions, transcribed the tapes, and printed them out. And then he handed back both the responses to the Mr. X scenario and the transcripts of their own role-playing exercise. And what they found was something that was a little dismaying for almost all of his students. They all did the things they said you shouldn't do. They criticized Mr. X for this, and then when they were interacting in real time with another person, they did this, and this. When he pointed this out to them, their response, for the most part, was, "Oh my God, am I doing that? I didn't know I was doing that." And if you've ever, for the first time, seen a video of your golf swing or your tennis or your teaching, you have probably had a similar experience. Oh, am I doing that? I didn't know I was doing that. What's going on here? Well, Argyris and his colleague, the late Donald Shern of MIT, developed a whole apparatus of organizational theory around this basic insight that there are 2 kinds of theories at work when people are interacting in organizations. One is what they call espoused theory. Espoused theory is the theory you espouse, what you say you should do. And so in the scenario, when they wrote the critique of Mr. X, they were espousing their theory of how a consultant should behave. But there's another kind of theory at work, and that is the theory that governs behavior, and they called that theory in use. Theory in use is the theory that determines how you act in a live situation. And what they got in the recorded role-playing exercises was the student's theory in use, which in almost every case, in this case, and there's been a lot of research on this since then, confirms that most people don't do what they think they should. That they have, important to note, your theory in use is really a theory. It's consistent. It's not that people just opportunistically do what seems like a good thing at a time. They follow consistent patterns, but they're generally unaware of the patterns. Argyris wrote, although people often do not behave congruently with their espoused theories, they do behave congruently with their theories in use, and his italics on the and they are unaware of that fact. We don't know when we're doing what we think we should do, or when we're doing something that follows a somewhat different pattern. And this brings us to the idea of the learning paradigm. The learning paradigm is basically the idea that what governs education should be what serves learning. We should do whatever increases and maximizes the amount, the quality, the resilience, and the effectiveness of student learning. I would submit that that is probably the espoused theory of everybody here, and probably 90-some% of college and university faculty and administrators, and probably higher than that for parents. They believe that we should maximize learning. But that's not, and I think this is pretty clear if we look at just some of the evidence I already presented, that's not what we being colleges and universities as organizations do. And that's where we come to the instruction paradigm, which is in fact the governing paradigm for most higher education institutions. Why do students go to college? Well, a lot of reasons, as you know, but in the vast majority of cases, one of the large motivating factors for going to college is that they want to get a degree. I think we can agree that most students would not attend college if they believed that getting a degree was not possible for them. So, and indeed, most of the students who drop out of college do so for precisely that reason. They don't believe that under the circumstances, they'll be able to finish. So why waste your time? The degree is, now, whether it's overvalued and undervalued, that's another thing. But the college defines success as the granting of a degree. That means we kiss you on the forehead and send you on your way. We approve of you as one of our graduates and an alumnus. How do you decide who gets a degree? Almost entirely, it depends on whether a person has completed 120 student credit hours. And that means whether they have completed a bunch of classes in which they get a grade of C or better on average. We'll talk about the grades a little bit more in a moment, but what this means is that colleges, their theory in use is people who take a bunch of classes, and the way they organize the classes and identify which ones go when, and that's all different. And not that it makes a great deal of difference. There's good evidence that it doesn't make much difference at all. Alexander Aston did a study with hundreds of thousands of longitudinal traces of students 20 years ago, where he found that the content of the general education curriculum, as far as anybody could tell, made no difference whatever to the outcomes for students. So these things we argue about in great passion are probably not as important as we think they are. But anyway, The degree is based on the completion of courses. The college's theory and use is you were a successful student if you have completed the courses. It is not part of the criterion of success that you learned anything in the courses, though it probably is for your teacher. I can give you exceptions to that rule, but I'm sure there are none of them here. But here's the thing. If you learned what you were supposed to learn by the time of the final exam, do you still know it 6 months later? Nobody tries to find this out for the most part, except in exceptions we'll talk about in just a moment. The instruction paradigm governs the way we do our job. Your job as a teacher requires, as a condition of employment, that you give an evaluative grade at the end of the semester. It does not require, as a condition of employment, that the people who got the evaluative grade continue to know any of the stuff they got it for. Now, you want them to. We do everything we can to get them to, but we know, I'm afraid, that in many cases they don't. And we'll get back to that in just a moment. Why, if we all think that students, this is about learning, but the organizations do not particularly prioritize learning, what's going on here? Why don't students learn? We try to get them to learn. Well, the quick answer to that would be that a lot of them, and I'm sure a lot of yours, are not motivated. Motivation is an interesting term. It's basically a metaphor from physics. It means moved. The soccer player playing on the field kicks the ball and motivates it across the field. Well, this metaphor assumes that the student is like the soccer ball, an inanimate object who is pushed by an external force to do something, to get someplace, to accomplish something. David Perkins of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, many years writing about K through 12 education, commented that probably physics isn't the best basis for our thinking about motivation, because in fact, students are not soccer balls. They're not inanimate objects that get kicked around or pushed this way or that way. They are, on the other hand, people who make choices. He said a better metaphor was be what he called the cognitive economy. In the economy, customers, agents make choices about how they'll spend their money, how they'll devote their working time, what they'll invest in. The cognitive economy of a class, Perkins said, is the metaphorical economy of gains and costs that students encounter. And the question for them, for the students, and for their trajectory through the experience, is this a hot economy or a cool economy? We've heard those terms in terms of, are we going into a recession, or are we going to have economic growth? Hot and cool economy. We can talk about that. Well, for the student, the same is true. And Perkins regretted that the typical classroom constitutes a cool rather than a hot cognitive economy, one that does not motivate the energy needed for complex cognition, but runs at an altogether lower level of cognitive demand. Complex cognition. What's that about? Well, there are a number of different approaches to take this. I like the theory of Ferenc Marton and Roger Selye, a couple of educators in Sweden who developed the theory of deep and surface approaches to learning. A surface approach is the approach a student takes who's just looking at the surface, trying to remember the words, the dates, the algorithms that he or she needs to do to get through the test. A deep approach is the approach a student who takes who is actually engaged in learning the stuff. And a couple of things will be obvious already. If you take a fixed mindset, you're unlikely to take a deep approach to learning, are you? If you take a growth mindset, you're much more likely to do so. So let me frame the question this way. What makes for a hot cognitive economy, both in your classroom and in college in general? I'm going to go through these things rather rapidly and, you know, take it for what it's worth. I've broken it down into six categories. Goals, activities, information, time, community, and alignment. Let's talk about each just a little bit. Goals. Why are students doing what they're doing as students? Well, there are two kinds of goals. There are intrinsic goals and extrinsic goals. You can do a thing because you want to get it done, or you can do a thing because somebody else told you to do it and you get a reward for doing it. If students are pursuing intrinsic goals, they're much more likely to pursue a deep approach to learning. If they're pursuing extrinsic goals, they're much less likely to do so. Edward Deci and Richard Ryan of the University of Rochester have this whole apparatus they call self-determination theory. And self-determination theory says that basically people do what they want to do, what they are invested in doing, and they tend to do a good job of it. Things that they aren't invested in doing, they don't do a very good job. They did a study of 100, meta-analysis of 128 studies comparing intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And they found something interesting. Tangible rewards which require engaging in the target activity do indeed undermine intrinsic motivation for that activity. So if you have something that somebody wants to do and then you give them a reward for doing it, they are less interested in doing it. Let me give you an example. Deci and his then graduate student, Carl Benware, did this study at the University of Rochester, I believe, where they took a bunch of students, a couple hundred. They told all the students, all right, we're going to give you some material and we're going to give you 3 hours to study it. And they had selected material, excerpts from textbooks, articles, that kind of thing. And they gave it to the students. It all dealt with the physiology of the brain, a subject that none of these students had very much background in, but it was quite readable at the level that they could handle. They divided the students into two groups. One group, they said, all right, we're going to have you study this material for 3 hours. And at the end of the 3 hours, we're going to give you a test on it. And depending on how well you do on the test, you'll get this further reward. The other half, they said, we're going to have you study this material for 3 hours. And at the end of the 3 hours, we're going to ask you to teach it to another group of undergraduates. And then they let them all study it for 3 hours. At the end of the 3 hours, of course, they lied. Psychologists, they're just terrible liars. You can't trust them. You really can't. They didn't have them. They gave everybody the same test. They'd all studied the same material. They all took the same test. Guess who did better on the test? I'll bet you can guess. The ones who had prepared to teach it to somebody else did very significantly better on the test than the ones who had been preparing for a test. Is this remarkable or not? One takeaway from this for me is the best way to study for a multiple choice test is not to study for a multiple choice test. And we can apply that in many. But the relevant thing here is students who thought they were going to have to do something real visible to other people in a setting in which they would be exposed for their knowledge or their ignorance learn the material much more efficiently than did students who just thought they were going to take a test on it. Now, does this apply to any college classes? If what students are doing when they take a college class is self-consciously preparing for a test, not just a multiple choice test, but predominantly a multiple choice test, It's not going to be intrinsically motivating. It's going to tend to defer intrinsic motivation. That extrinsic motivation, or that extrinsic rewards actually deteriorate intrinsic motivation. Daniel Pink, you may have seen his book Drive, says this is one of the most robust findings in social science and also one of the most ignored. In the learning paradigm, we should seek to promote intrinsic goals and to minimize extrinsic goals. That's goals. What about activities? These are closely interrelated, as you see. What do students do when they're studenting? Let me make a distinction here between what I'll call authentic performance and tests and drills. Authentic performance is defined by Grant Wiggins, a great scholar of assessment, as the kind of work real people do. You're doing something that matters to you and to somebody else for its own sake, not just for the sake of being assessed on it. The student writing in the student newspaper and publishing an article, the student performing in the band and playing the tuba, the student playing football on the field, they're doing those things because they believe the things have value. They want the audience to enjoy it. They want to win, but they also want to be seen to have won. So they're engaged in an authentic activity. The student who takes the multiple choice test, the student who writes the article for the paper is going to take the article, take it home, show it to mom and dad, show it to their friends, say, look, this is what the student who takes the multiple choice test, if it's an A, will wave the grade around, but the contents of the test are of no interest to anybody, including the student after the grade's in. This is why Richard Light, who conducted the Harvard assessment projects back in the 2000s, they published a book called Making the Most of College. This was interviews with thousands of students, not just at Harvard, started at Harvard, but it was about 24 different colleges, and basically asking the students what was good, what was bad, what'd you like, what was valuable to you. And this is one of the conclusions he reached. I assumed that most important and memorable academic learning goes on inside the classroom, while outside activities provide a modest but useful supplement. The evidence shows that the opposite is true. Learning outside of classes is vital. We asked students to think of a specific critical incident or moment that had changed them profoundly. 4/5 of them chose a situation or an event outside the classroom. Most students find their experience in extracurricular activities, but well, you've read some of the research on what's the George Koo's thing, high impact practices. What is it about high impact practices that makes them high impact? Well, in all of them, you're not just studying for the test. If what students do is largely to prepare for tests on which they are evaluated, they won't be intrinsically motivated. So let's move to the third category, information. And I would make a distinction here. There are two kinds of information that come to students in response to what they do as students. And those are evaluation and feedback. Evaluation is a judgment on your performance. The quintessential example of evaluation is the final semester grade. That says you are a B student. It is a pure evaluation because it is permanent and it is, with passingly few exceptions, non-negotiable and non-changeable. The student who gets a C in organic chemistry will die with a C in organic chemistry. the student may win the Nobel Prize in chemistry, but she'll still have the C in organic chemistry. They used to say the only thing permanent were death and taxes, no grades. Your transcript will live longer than you do. And certainly given modern technology. So pure evaluation is a judgment. Feedback, on the other hand, is information about what you've done that guides you towards how to do it better next time. So when the football team watches the game films, they're getting feedback on what they actually did, not what they thought they meant to do. So they're bringing their theory and use, which they practice on the field, in line with their espoused theory, what coach has been telling them to do over and over again this semester. Likewise for all sports, likewise for the person writing for the student newspaper. The student produces the draft of the article and then gets it marked up. The purpose of marking it up is not just to be evaluated better on it, but to publish it so that people who read it will find it more edifying. There was an interesting article a few years ago, I think it was in 2000, in the Journal of Higher Education, called When the Tail Wags the Dog by Howard Polio and Hall Beck. They took a few hundred students from a couple of large universities, and they gave them the logo instrument. The logo instrument was developed back in the 80s by Polio and some of his colleagues to measure whether students take a learning orientation or a grade orientation. And what they found back then was most students feel that college forces upon them a grade orientation rather than learning orientation, and they don't like it. So they took these I don't know, several hundred students, and then they also took the teachers of the classes these students came from, and they gave the logo survey to the students in the classes, and they gave a slightly modified version of the logo survey for faculty to the teachers of the classes. And long story short, what they found was that everybody agreed that the classes emphasized grades more than they emphasized learning. Everybody agreed that they didn't like that. The students wanted classes, and their ideal faculty member would be a faculty member who would emphasize learning over grades. The faculty obviously wanted more emphasis on learning because that's what they were in this for. What's interesting, what's the difference then? The teachers, when asked why there was such an emphasis on grades rather than learning, said, well, it's the students. They always wanting all this information about grades. They make me give them grades and everything. Students mandate it. When they asked the students, the students said, well, the teachers make us. I mean, they're grading everything. They're telling us from the beginning in the syllabus that everything depends on grades. I have to share a quotation from this article. It is not difficult to understand why students might come to the conclusion that instructors overly stress grade orientation and give only short shrift to learning orientation. Almost every syllabus contains descriptions of how grades are calculated. Few address the need to find excitement in the course material. Colleges regularly establish remedial classes for students receiving poor grades. They rarely, if ever, offer remedial instruction for students unable to find excitement in English literature or physics. Grades are required as a part of every class, but instructors are not obliged to stimulate interest in course content. In fact, it is possible for someone to teach for an entire career and not excite interest in his or her discipline. Any instructor who failed to assign grades would be dismissed after only a short tenure. We know that in many cases, in the traditional writing class, for example, students read the grade and ignore the comments. You stay up late at night commenting on how this piece of writing could be improved. What are the mistakes? What are the possibilities for expansion? If they get an A, that's it. If they get a D, maybe they'll figure out what buttons to push. But essentially, students focus first on the grade and then on the correctives. That led me several years ago to stop giving grades. Now, this has now become a thing, degrading or ungrading or whatever they call it. There are books about this. I recommend them. It's a good idea. But back in the old days when, and by the way, I only got away with this because nobody knew I was doing it, as you might, I said, well, look, I'm not going to grade any of your work until it's finished. We will have a final portfolio of your work at the end of the semester, and that's what you get graded on. So at any point in the semester, if you're finished with an essay, a piece of work, you bring it into me, you say, this is finished, I'm going to put it in my portfolio, and I give you a grade on it. But after that, you can't revise it anymore. But if you want to revise it, you can just keep revising it until you're finished. Now, in over 10 years of following this policy, guess how many students came into me and said, I want my grade on this essay? Not one. Not one. And frankly, that amazed me. I was flabbergasted. I couldn't believe it. But you think about it from their point of view, why did they not declare the work finished? Because they thought they could still improve it. And you know what? They were always right. They could. Now, did they? No, sometimes they ran out of time. Sometimes they procrastinated. They did all the stupid things your students do. But they had that feeling at the back of their head, I could just a few tweaks here and I could make this even better. And so it wasn't until the end of the semester and the final portfolio that I got to grade everybody. Interestingly, as a sideline on that practice, I asked students at the end of the semester to grade themselves. I said, given what you know, the rubrics we've used, the criteria, and what you've submitted in your portfolio, what grade would you give yourself? And I was again amazed that there were very few cases where the student would give themselves a grade higher than I would have. I couldn't believe that at first, but it persisted for years. Anyway, there are a lot of other ways you can get around the evaluation feedback dilemma. Evaluation tends to drive out feedback. So if you can separate them, for example, the testing effect, we know that one of the greatest ways to learn things is to be tested on it. If you are tested on material a week after you first learned it, and then you're tested on it again, you tell one group to study it, study it, and the other group, you test them on it. The ones who are tested on it remember it better than the ones who study it, partly because they don't know how to study it. If they really want to study it, what they would do is test themselves on it, but that's another story. What we find is students who are tested repeatedly remember the stuff they're tested on. The problem is that if you're just tested once on the material, how do we know whether that works or not? And if your focus is only on the letter grade and not, there are ways of making testing effective. I'm not against testing. So information, evaluation or feedback. In a learning paradigm college, we would emphasize evaluation and de-emphasize, or emphasize feedback and de-emphasize evaluation. Time horizon. Time horizon is the answer to the question, how long will I have to live with the consequences of this act or activity? When you go on vacation and you rent a car for maybe a week or 2 weeks, you give a certain amount of attention to what model of car you get, but probably if you're like me, you main attention is on, will it hold all the luggage and is it on the lot? When you buy a car that you plan to drive possibly for several, in my case, 13 so far years, you think a lot more about it. You go to Consumer Reports, you study the reviews, you talk to people who have driven this car. You drive the car before you buy it. You do all those things. Why? Because the time horizon of this decision is much longer than the time horizon of the rental decision. And we do that throughout. We're going to pay much more attention to the condition of a house we're taking out a mortgage on than we are a house that we're renting on a 1-year lease. Because if it doesn't work, we can move. But if you've got a mortgage, it's much more complicated. The time horizon is longer. A long time horizon encourages intrinsic motivation, and it encourages a deep approach to learning. I've asked this question of, and I'll wrap up here pretty quickly. I know I'm going on. I tend to do that. It's occupational hazard, you understand? I've asked this question of a number of colleges, four-year colleges, of faculty, and I don't know how, but I always say, look, only respond to this if you have taught in the last 5 years both general education classes and classes in your major. How many, where are the students better? Are they better in general ed or in the major? Now, there are always a few who love the young ones and have a sort of sentimental attachment to them, but overwhelmingly, faculty say students are better students in the major. Why would this be? They're the same students. Why would they be better students in the major than they are in general education? For the same reason that they're better students on the tennis team or the debate team or in the school newspaper than they are in their classes. Because the time horizon of a class, especially a standalone class, is arbitrarily cut off at the end of 16 or 12, I gather, in the case of some institutions. You have this many weeks to learn what you can learn about this. And at the end, we label your competence for the rest of your life in what you've studied in this class. And that's the end of it. It's over. Go away. We don't say go away. We say go on to higher and greater things. But what we mean is go away because, you know, class is over. The time horizon in college is brutally limited. It's like a Procrustean bed where we say, if you're longer than this semester, we cut off your knees and, you know, that's it. The newspaper isn't like that. The band isn't like that. You can start out as a kind of, you know, trial tuba player at the beginning, and if you can hold your own, you can start out as a kind of a mediocre tennis player, but one who won some matches. But you can keep at it for 2 or 3 years until you make the varsity or until you are in the jazz band, except the jazz band probably doesn't have a tuba. But anyway, you take my meaning. The possibilities are not endless, but they're longer in extracurricular activities. The possibilities in the major are longer. Now, not all majors are well designed and so on and so forth, but it's really possible for a student in a major to see that what she is doing in this class is connected to something that she's going to be doing in the future, and especially if she has a career goal or a post-graduate school goal related to the major. A long time horizon reinforces the learning paradigm. Community. In the learning paradigm, we would encourage purposeful communities of practice. Alexander Aston, in one of his massive longitudinal studies, concluded, tracing several cohorts for about 7 years, he concluded this: the students' peer group is the single most potent source of influence on growth and development during the undergraduate years. And I don't believe he would revise that conclusion today. Years ago, I was teaching my class the way I always taught my class then, and it was we would come into class, students would get in groups, they would read what one another wrote, respond to it briefly in writing, and then talk about it, and then report back to the whole group. And a student I had encountered walking someplace on the campus, and we just got to talking, and the student said, "Oh yeah, well, this is my favorite class." And of course, I immediately internally perked up with pride at my extraordinary abilities as a teacher, which were being rewarded here. And then he went on, he said, "Yeah, I love this class. It's the only class I'm taking where I know anybody else in the class." So it wasn't me, it was them. But the idea that students can learn from one another is a powerful one. Let me close with an example that I use in my latest book. Um, I was visiting a community college in California and was going into some classes. They had a learning community. Learning communities, of course, are as supported by the Washington Center at Evergreen State College, is a system where you combine two or more classes and they're team taught, and the students meet together. Um, this was a learning community in developmental math and English, and which was new to me at the time. So I went into the class, the teachers had left, and I handed everybody a 3x5 card, and I said, just jot down 2 or 3 things that you think someone should know about this class. And then I collected the cards and I asked them if they had any comments they'd like to share. And it was really quite striking. This class consisted of students who had been overwhelmed by math anxiety for most of their lives, certainly for their post high school life. And most of them thought, I mean, they said this, they said, "I didn't think I could learn math. I thought I was just terrible at math." They had a fixed mindset about math and they thought they were bad at it. But they said, this class has been completely different from anything else I've ever done before. What did they do in that class? They got into groups of 6 or fewer and they worked together to solve math problems. Then, remember, it was an English class too. They wrote descriptions of how you solve the math problems, and they wrote new math problems, word problems. That was a large part of the writing portion of the course. And then they formulated new problems that they would give to the next group. They were working intensely with one another all the time. And they were learning this stuff. A young woman in the back of the room raised her hand and she said, "Well, you know," she had a very quiet voice. She said, "You know, my sister is taking the same class." And the thing is, she's not taking a learning community like this. She's just taking a regular class where they lecture. But we both have the same book. We both have the same tests. But when she comes home, she doesn't understand any of it. I have to explain it to her. And I can't. It blew me away. The 2 students, the sister who's taking the regular lecture course and was getting basically nothing out of it, and the student who was taking this highly interactive learning community, if they came away with the same letter grade, on the transcript, they would be identical. There would be no difference. But the difference was that in one class, they were paying attention to what they learned and really learning it. And in the other class, they were trying to prepare for the test and doing a really dismal job of it. We come back to the point that the best way to prepare for a test isn't to prepare for a test. And tests can be effective if they're used in a context where they can lead somewhere to feedback about learning that the student actually wants to apply. Final categories alignment. And the problem is with most of our institutions today is they're very badly aligned. Why? Because they have a theory in use, which is the instruction paradigm, that says what counts about this place is the grade you get at the end of every semester in every discrete class. And that's the rule the college follows, the university follows in deciding who to reward with the big enchilada, the degree at the end. We all have an intrinsic espoused theory, the learning paradigm that we really believe, but we're constantly running into the fact that our theory in use has to change if we're going to carry out what we really want to achieve. And I'll stop there because I'm sorry it went on for so long.